Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. Before I even get started, this is my second attempt at this recording. I only got a couple of minutes into it and I had to stop. I have a parrot, and one of my dogs doesn't like a certain pitch that the parrot sometimes hits. So I'm constantly balancing their opposing needs. I can't abandon the parrot alone for a long time downstairs. They're too smart. It's not good to isolate them. So she has her own little CD player and her favorite CDs, and I put some music on for her. She's singing along with the CD, and every once in a while she hits that pitch that the little dog doesn't like. It hurts her ears, I think, and she starts to whine. And the parrot is smart, and she understands what the dog's whining about. So she on purpose hits that pitch again. And so we have this ongoing battle of the bird doing this shrill sound and the dog whining. The more the dog whines, the more noise the parrot makes. I had to stop, go down, separate them in totally different rooms. They can't help but hear themselves. I may have broken the spell, but if you hear noise in the background, that's what's going on, and I apologize. So, if you're a new member, welcome. This is what it's like if you're a new subscriber. Never a dull moment at my house. Welcome. If you're new, I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope you'll find a variety of things to entertain you on the video list. If you're a returning member or returning subscriber, I'm so grateful. And if you're a member, you're special on my list, and I appreciate it. For those who don't know, the membership is 99 cents, and it's intended purely to present an option for some in-depth look at things behind a wall of privacy of sorts. So if you're interested in pursuing some of these topics, take a look at what's on the private side, and you might find something worth pursuing. I also do private consultations, and I have a SUBSTACK called Ask Your Irish Granny. I do take questions. They do become anonymous when I print them, and it's an advice column. However, I put a lot of things on my Substack that I cannot put on YouTube. Either the topic is too sensitive, or certain words have to be used, or I also like to provide some stuff for the members over there. So I also like to write some funny essays, at least they amuse me. So anyway, that's the business. Let's get down to what we're really interested in. So I usually have a big list of political ideas to talk about, or metaphysical, paranormal, kind of depends on my mood. They often present themselves, as we've talked about before. It's uncanny, the synchronicity. And even with this topic today, there was an element of synchronicity. I had to laugh, you know. So I was looking the other day at this site, this day in history. I often get ideas from that, like my coverage of the Voting Rights Act. I didn't realize when I recorded that, well, when I prepared to record it, that we were heading into an anniversary. It was perfect timing. So there's that. But today is the anniversary, August 13th, 1521, of the fall of the Aztec Empire. It's the official end date. It was a long process and an ongoing process after that. But this is the day that's considered the fall of the Aztec Empire. And I started to do a little reading about it. I read about it. I took a class in it in college. In the dark ages, we were still writing on cuneiform tablets. And, you don't necessarily remember everything that you learned when you were, 19. So it was interesting to refresh my memory. And as I pursued it, I realized, there's a connection here to present day current events. And we're going to pursue that in the membership. I think you'll be interested. So let's talk about Mexico City. Now, I'm going to call it Mexico City, but that was the European modern eventual term. The city itself that we're starting with is the center of the Aztec Empire and was called Tenochtitlan. I apologize for all the mispronunciations. If you are Mexican or indigenous and I'm just destroying your history, I do apologize. It's not intentional. I'm doing my best. This is a very superficial look in honor of the day, the fall of this really fascinating empire. So let's take a look and see, because there are some really interesting things here. So on August the 13th of 1521, the Aztecs surrendered because they were killed off, basically, after a 3-month siege of the city of Tenochtitlan by Hernán Cortés, the Spanish conquistador, and his handful of soldiers, and the indigenous people who allied with them, and, you know, the assorted priests and hangers-on. And this is the moment that really began the full-blown Spanish colonization and the end of the Aztec Empire and the rise of Spanish power in the area, until eventually, 300 years later, there's a lot to cover. We're going to just superficially look at it. Spanish independence, which was in 1821. It became a sovereign republic. And all of this started with the Aztec Empire in Tenochtitlan. So it began as a city-state in 1325 AD. So to put it in perspective, it was right before the outbreak of the Black Death that wiped out more than 2/3 of the population of Europe in the late 1330s, 1340s. And the rise of city-states in the, Middle Ages. This was the Middle Ages. And, the start of things like, well, in the middle of the movement of like the Crusades and all that stuff, just to give you a little tiny perspective. The Aztecs, meanwhile, were killing it. They were very interesting culture. They were the dominant force in this whole area. By the time Cortés showed up in 1519, the population in the city of Tenochtitlan was anywhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. It's hard to know because so much information was destroyed, but they extrapolate, and that's the number they came up with. As many as 200,000 people. That's mind-blowing. When a big city in Europe was like 10,000 maybe. So the city itself began, there was nothing there, and well, there were scattered indigenous people there that lived there, but there was no huge city. The Aztecs migrated to the Valley of Mexico after the fall of the Toltec Empire. And that's a whole other story. It's really interesting. But they built this city on a small island in Lake Texcoco. Maybe it's Texcoco, but looks like Texcoco. Their religious mythology was that their main god, whose name I'm not even going to try to pronounce, led them to this spot. We'll talk a little more about it in a minute. They would see a sign. They would see an eagle on a cactus with a snake in its beak. And it happened. This was a very old myth. They didn't concoct the myth after the fact. This was, for real, the myth. And there's actual written discussion of this, but it's post-colonial because, as I said, the Spanish destroyed everything they could get their hands on. But there are a number of codices. Now, codex was a pictorial manuscript And there was a priest who replicated some of them. And I actually saw his replications, his replicas of these codices in a museum. And it looked like he made them yesterday with colored pencils from Crayola. That's how beautiful and vibrant and precise and really interesting they were. I don't speak Spanish, but just to look at them, you could tell that this was a rich culture, rich in depth of the culture and gold. Okay, so these codices were made after the Spanish conquest, and they tell of this story being part of the ancient mythos of the people and their religion. And the picture of the eagle on a cactus with the snake is in the center of the modern day Mexican flag. So stuff went on, which we'll talk a little bit about between the time that Cortez just landed and the time that Tenochtitlan was defeated. And by the time that it reached its defeat, it was an empire that covered a huge chunk of Mesoamerica, from the Gulf of Mexico in the east to the Pacific Ocean in the west and south, all the way down the Yucatan. So there are two parallel stories of the evolution of the Aztec Empire, and then the fall of it and the evolution of the city of Mexico, the state of Mexico. And one is purely archaeological and the other is mythological, and they often converge, but sometimes they don't. So we're going to talk about just what the people say. There had been an empire. Now, here I go, wrecking this word, Teotihuacan. And it disappeared in around 750 AD. Big questions, what happened? And the people that were there next were the Toltecs, and they ruled around that time to about 1200 AD. And now we're using the conventional AD BC just because it's easier for a lot of people. It's not official academic, but it's easier. And it's certainly Western Civ European. It's not how they would have characterized their calendar as indigenous people. So around that time, about 1200, there was a migration of people, and they moved in and created city-states. And there were a number of these independent from each other small urban centers around this lake. They all claimed that they were various descendants of the Toltec. Eventually, there were about a dozen of these sort of urban city-state groups, independent of each other, not always friends, that were big enough to have about 10,000 people roughly each. And there were other scattered people, but we're talking about the defined urban small areas. Tenochtitlan was the biggest, and it was on this island in the middle of the lake. And its population was as big as 200,000. Nobody knows for sure. So the founders of it had migrated, as I said, and over time, they landed in Tenochtitlan. They landed in the middle of this lake, and following the guided by the word of their God in their mythology, their religious mythology. They called themselves the Mexica. They claimed they came from a place called Aztlan, that it also was an island on a lake, and that they had a city there, and that when all that fell apart, they were sent by their God to establish a new home that kind of replicated it. So after a number of years and a lot of battles with these smaller groups of people, they established what they called Mexica. And there were a few sacrificed hearts, because human sacrifice, offering the heart, the still beating heart of your victim, was part of their religion. And they felt like, okay, now we followed the guidance of our God and we're here, and we saw the eagle on the cactus with the snake and an island in the lake, and we're settled, and here we are. They were a monarchy, and before Spain arrived, this is really interesting. Before the Spanish arrived, Tenochtitlan was one of the largest, richest urban areas in the world. It had infrastructure and amenities that weren't known anywhere else. Now, that does not to say that other places didn't know about how to do it, but at this time, no place in Europe had this sort of infrastructure. In the past, some of it had existed. For example, running water indoors, a source of water inside with toilets that had water that went through them. The Romans had those. The wealthy Romans had those. But by the time the Middle Ages came around, it was like everybody took a step backwards in civilization, if you define civilization by the existence of flush toilets, which I do. So the Aztecs had things like potable water that was brought in by aqueducts. That should sound familiar. They had a full drainage system in this island. They had paved streets that were really beautifully paved, wide boulevards for big processions and lots of traffic. We're talking big. This is certainly a lot, multiple times bigger than where I live. They had huge markets, public outdoor markets with an enormous variety of produce and objects for sale. Where Tenochtitlan was located on the island is now the dead center heart of Mexico City, which is, of course, way much bigger now. But this city of the Aztecs was planned intentionally before it was built, with streets and canals aligned according to compass points so that it was orderly. It was all square blocks and straight streets and perpendicular intersections, and very clean, and no refuse or excrement. They had an extremely sophisticated social system of peacekeeping, cleanliness keeping, what's it called? Public works, I guess, which I'm not going into today, but I've learned about it before. And it really is kind of mind-boggling because we are poorly educated into thinking that we invented everything. Well, that's not true at all. The city on the island was divided into 4 neighborhoods with distinct councils, and they intersected at the center in a main square, which was the heart of the empire. That's where the main temples were, the palaces of the nobility, the home of the monarch. They had the House of the Demons and the House of Flowers, and we know that those existed. They had 2 main schools there. They had a secular one, which was just for education, and they had like a seminary, a school for priests of their religion. You can kind of think of it a bit like Venice, not entirely, but a bit like Venice. They had canals and boats, and people traveled to and from the mainland and then could go through into the city on these canals. So now we'll talk about the actual conquest. When Cortez landed in near what is today Veracruz, he heard about this city. He heard rumors, and he was a little bit worried because he didn't have very many Spanish soldiers with them. But he was able to capitalize on the fact that there were rivalries and territorial grievances and grudges between a lot of these city-states and each other, and almost all of them, and the Aztecs in charge at Tenochtitlan. They were in charge, and there was a lot of resentment and disagreement. So he was able to sort of take advantage of that pragmatically and get them to work with him. He was very lucky in the sense that he didn't have very many soldiers with him. I want to say somewhere between around 1,000, maybe a little fewer, and some horses. And they had guns, and it was the technology of the horses and guns that really made the difference. But anyway, they all got together and they decided, let's join forces and let's go destroy these people. Who do they think they are? So the natives assumed that the Spanish would help them get out from underneath the domination of Tenochtitlan and the Aztecs. But that's not what happened. The Spanish dominated everybody in the end. They ended up being enslaved and their culture destroyed. Now, sometimes people say this differently, but I looked it up, and the chief of the Aztecs at the time was called Moctezuma, and he heard about Cortez. Now, this was the original story that now is fallen out of favor. Historians think this is just an apocryphal story. It's not really true. But the story was that they heard about Cortez and they thought that the arrival of the Spanish was fulfilling this prophecy of the return of the god Quetzalcoatl. And they thought Cortez was the reincarnation, I guess, or the manifestation of Quetzalcoatl. And there were some elements of the arrival of Cortez that led them to believe that were replicated in the myth. Was the direction that he arrived, the fact that his soldiers were light-skinned with beards and short hair. All of this was in the religious prophecy. But they don't really believe that anymore. They think, no, what you had was a problem with language. The Spanish misunderstood what was going on. So what happened was the Aztecs didn't think the Spanish were gods. They knew they were up against something, but it was their cultural diplomacy that when they greeted a potential ally or potential enemy, they went with gifts and ceremony as a sign of peaceful intent. So they approached Cortez that way. The Spanish first saw Tenochtitlan in November 8, 1519, and these are some quotes from their writings. They were stunned by its beauty and size. They were met with curious crowds. Moctezuma greeted them at the city center. He was carried in on a litter, and they exchanged gifts. They then put the Spaniards up in fancy apartments, and what they don't say on the internet too much is they not only gave them food and access to like indoor running water, which wowed the Spanish, but women too. It was bad. Later, the Aztec accounts spoke disparagingly about how passively Moctezuma greeted the Spanish. His own people were disappointed in him. They knew to be afraid. And they all felt he was too deferential, too generous. And one observer wrote, as it was as if everyone had eaten stupefying mushrooms. Terror dominated everyone, as if the world were being disemboweled. People fell into a fearful slumber. Well, this very much sounds like a trauma response, freezing in shock, fight or flight, or freeze. And then the fourth is fawn, which is, kiss up to. And I think we're seeing a little of all of these things. This was a very short-lived peace. It didn't last. The Spanish very quickly were horrified by the religious rites of the Aztecs, which included human sacrifice. And they started to get a little hot under the collar that they were next because they were grossly outnumbered. So they were in the heart of the city, in the palaces, where the nobility were. And so they very cleverly took over the center of control of the empire and arrested Moctezuma and put him in house arrest. But the Aztec people were angry at the passivity of Moctezuma, and they didn't like the fact that the Spanish were making ongoing demands and aggressively with disrespect for gold, criticizing their religion, and they were mistreating people, as you can imagine, extrapolate. And unrest began starting in the heart of the city. So Cortez had to quell this with a a fake formal ceremony to placate everybody. They paraded out Moctezuma. I don't know what he was told, but he went along and he swore allegiance to the Spanish king and to Cortez as the representative of the Spanish king. Next, Cortez had his soldiers go into the temples and destroy the idols that were the Mexica statues of their religion and replace them with Christian ones. And I'll tell you, the question I had was, if I were taking a very small ship that I didn't want to overload with garbage, I'd rather take water and food, and I was going to an unknown place across the ocean, would I really take religious statues and artifacts? I don't know. So meanwhile, keep in mind, this is not the only place the Spanish were infiltrating and colonizing. There were Spaniards in Cuba, and they were more settled there. The Spanish-Cuban governor sent troops to Tenochtitlan to arrest Cortez because he didn't get sent to conquer the Aztecs. He was upsetting the stability in the region, and Cuba was worried. They didn't want their indigenous people rising up. They were also being enslaved and unhappy. So they arrested Cortez. He was there to establish trade, and that is not what he did. He fled, and he returned to Veracruz, and he left a guy called Pedro de Alvarado to deal with Tenochtitlan, and he fled. Alvarado was busy imprisoning important nobility. He imprisoned two of the most important Aztec leaders. He killed several others. Then he ordered a massacre during a spring festival. Now, I imagine, I'm making this up, but it just seems logical that the people had this festival every year, and there were religious overtones, and there was a human sacrifice or two, and the Spanish freaked out and ordered a massacre. Cortez returned and found that the Spanish essentially had been locked out of the city, and it was under siege. And I found my sources were not clear. I don't know at this point if Cortez made it back into the city, or if all the Spaniards were outside the city, or if there were some inside and some outside. But we'll just gloss over that, and we'll just say that the city had no drinking water and no food because they were under siege, and they tried to use Moctezuma to pacify the people to allow them to open up the city, and Moctezuma died, and it's unknown. It's not clear what happened to him. Was he intentionally killed? Did he try to escape and he was killed? Was there a battle and he was killed? Nobody knows. So this, of course, caused a huge uproar, and the Spanish got trapped because the natives from all over, they'd had enough of these guys, and they showed up in canoes and sailed the canals into the city and surrounded the Spanish, and they were killed. Cortez, who's like a cat in 9 lives, he was able to escape and fled with some of his men. Some were caught while fleeing, and some were caught and killed in the city. So several thousand natives died. Somewhere between 600 and 1,000 Spaniards died. So they must have had more than 1,000 with them to begin with. I warned you this was going to be light on serious details. Many of the soldiers, this is really interesting, they either drowned or couldn't run away because they were so laden down with the gold that they were stealing. Anyway, Cortez got away, and he rebuilt his indigenous military. And the Aztecs thought, okay, they're gone. It's good. It's over. They elected a new king, and Cuauhtémoc, I think is how his name is pronounced. He was only in his 20s. He was young, but he was considered a charismatic leader. He was the nephew of the uncle of Moctezuma. So Cortez came back. He laid siege to the city. The siege went on for 3 months. Once again, no food, no water, and eventually diseases that the the Spaniards had transmitted things that the indigenous people had never been exposed to, started to decimate the people. It was, the conditions inside the city were horrible. I've read a book and it was were just terrible. After 3 months, the natives were in such a weakened condition that the Spaniards were able to get onto the island and get into the city, and there was a hand-to-hand, house-to-house combat until the natives were defeated. Cuauhtémoc surrendered on August 13th, 1521, over 500 years ago. And the Spanish slowly went on to completely destroy the culture and all evidence of it. The area became a constantly growing and ever more powerful globally Spanish colonial territory, starting in 1521 to 1821, 300 years. Then there was, of course, a rebellion against Spain, and in 1824, officially, they declared a republic. Then I thought I would mention, and this is a very superficial mention, of the Mexican-American War. The U.S. Army invaded Mexico, 1846. This battle went on for a couple of years, and it ended with the fall of Mexico City again in 1847. It ended with a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, and the annexation of Texas, that up until that point considered itself an independent republic. This was considered sort of a prelude to the United States Civil War. There were issues around Texas and slavery. If it came on as a slave state into the Union, it would upset the balance of slave states versus non-slave states. So there was a lot going on there, and we're not going to talk about that much today. But it ended with significant territorial losses for Mexico at the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. I was looking to find who the heroes were of this Mexican side, and I typed in who were the heroes of, this Mexican-American War, and I got Winfield Scott, and I think it was Zachary Taylor. I kind of went, oh no, I didn't pay attention because that's not what I meant. So I did pursue it a little bit more, and the great hero of Mexican independence really is singled out because France then invaded. France thought they'd take over. And it seems like one of them was related to Napoleon at one point. That's quite a story. But anyway, the man who was Mexican, who advocated for independent Mexico, for a liberal government, was Benito Juarez. And interestingly enough, he is often compared to Abraham Lincoln. So today, there is a woman who is president. And I think I have, this is where current events come into play. And I was concerned. I've been having, that gnawing gut feeling that we should all be concerned about these threats that are being made to send U.S. military across the border into Mexico to fight the cartels. So I did a little research on the new president and her party and what she stands for, and then looked into this situation. And I think I'm going to cover that in the private feed, the members only. And we're going to do a deeper dive, if you know what that means. So I hope you'll join us because this is a very interesting story. I learned a lot about her and about what's going on in Mexico today and their attitude and how they are handling the United States. And it's fascinating. So please join me. And thank you very much. And this little video is in honor of a lost people. And I, don't have strong affiliations to the Aztec Empire, but I always feel a pang when I hear about a culture that is so sophisticated and so developed. And sure, there were bad things. I mean, human sacrifice. But they had a lot of written materials that were destroyed, and that always gets me in my gut. So thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate it. Welcome everybody who's new. Thank you for returning everybody who's returned. Think about membership. Check out my Substack. Ask Your Irish Granny. Ask me anything. I have 5 kids. I'm used to giving advice. And thank you for joining me in Slán go fóill. Slánte.